Every year since 2015 without fail, veteran players return in droves to the blood-soaked, moonlight-washed streets of Yharnam, descending upon the cobblestones like a sweeping curtain of crows to resurrect Bloodborne anew once again, each time for a new generation of players. This event, this pilgrimage of hunters known as Return to Yharnam, begins from the anniversary of Bloodborne's launch and lasts a whole 2 weeks. During the event, players new and old engage in the game's co-op, both helping and hindering each other, returning the game to a level of activity similar to its launch so many years ago, when the streets were freshly awash with the blood of beasts. Outside of the Souls series, which often inspires such fervent fandom, this sort of dedication, devotion even, feels almost unprecedented. Bloodborne, as of 2023, is a massive 8 years old, yet it continues to delight and captivate players even today. Even players like myself, who profess to know the game inside and out, find plenty of joy in walking those streets once again, under the dreadful light of a blood moon. Bloodborne is my favourite game I've ever played. It's the best game I've ever played, and as far as I'm concerned is From Software's magnum opus, their masterpiece title, a pitch-perfect, legendary example of exquisite design, both in its gorgeous, intricately crafted world and art, and of course its timeless, impeccable gameplay. Am I just here to gush about Bloodborne today? Well, maybe. What is there really left to say about one of the most critically acclaimed, picked apart and analysed titles of recent memory? Well, I want to try and make it a little more personal. 8 years on from the release of Bloodborne in March of 2015, why do players continue to return to Yharnam time after time? What is it about Bloodborne that stirs an undying flame in the hearts of players? Is it as simple as a drive, a thirst, an unending hunger? A hunter must hunt, after all. There's a pull to the world of Bloodborne that only those that have experienced it will truly understand. Making our way through the Eldritch insanity felt like an isolating, lonesome journey at first, but really it was a community baptism in madness. So why is Bloodborne often called one of the greatest games of all time? What is it about this particular game that roots it so deeply in the minds of many? In this retrospective, I want to dive back into the darkness. This is my manifesto, my letter to you and my ode to one of the best games ever built. If you've played Bloodborne before, you'll probably get where I'm coming from, but if not, then I implore you to try it if you can. In fact, it's still free right now as part of the PlayStation Plus collection on PS5, which is an unbelievable steal. There's no better time to jump in than when the moon hangs low over the streets of Yharnam. Just be careful you don't turn into a beast yourself. Welcome to Bloodborne, a retrospective return to madness. I imagine my history with Bloodborne is one that's fairly common among players. For me, it all began in 2014, almost at the very beginning. At 21 years old, I was fresh out of university, and at the time the PlayStation 4 was riding high. It stood head and shoulders over the Xbox One as the player's choice of console after Microsoft's incredibly botched launch just 6 or so months prior. But even with the immense goodwill behind it, the truth was PS4 didn't have that many must-have exclusive titles to its name yet. At the time, I'd enjoyed launch title Killzone Shadowfall, and yes, even Knack to some degree, but the title I'd considered the first real jump to next-gen was none other than infamous Second Son, released in March of 2014. This was during a time where, if I could afford to, I was determined to pick up as many PlayStation 4 exclusives as I could to well and truly embroil myself within the ecosystem. Looking back, I think this mindset stemmed from a combination of the excitement that was seemingly constantly ramping up around the PS4 itself, even post-launch, and it being a time in my life where I was finally beginning to get into games, so to speak. That's not to say I hadn't been playing games religiously since the era of the N64 and the PS1, but as a young adult I was starting to understand not just the games I was playing a bit better, but the relentless industry marching behind them. It was an exciting and, frankly, formative time. But I'd never played a Souls game in my life. I'd never even heard of From Software. The only piece of information I tangentially knew was that the Souls series, at this point simply the trifecta of Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2, was renowned for being difficult, punishingly so, and that turned me away from them at the time. From Software and Souls was such a blind spot for me that I completely missed and would never have understood the implications of the leak of Project Beast, our first look at what Bloodborne would become, featuring such oddities now as the cleric beast in the Grand Cathedral that would later become the boss room of Vicar Amelia, for instance. I was there, however, when the name Bloodborne was leaked prior to E3 2014, though I never put two and two together like so many others. And so, E3 2014 arrived, and Bloodborne was first revealed to the public with a CG trailer. I didn't really know what to expect, and where I imagined stalwart From fans were already excited, I wasn't. I wasn't even really sure what I was looking at, but I was curious. As mentioned before, it was a confirmed PS4 exclusive, so I was leaning towards trying it anyway. But what really caught my eye was the slivers of a setting that we got to see. For those of you that don't know, the Victorian Gothic is one of, if not my absolute favourite settings, visual designs and motifs in media. Just seeing that sweeping shot of Yharnam moving from the crooked, eerily ghost-lit rooftops to the densely packed yet abandoned alleyway laden with chains and statues was enough to get me intrigued. This initial reveal was absolutely oozing with atmosphere, a dripping horror vibe, and an obvious creative talent that helped it leap off the screen in comparison with the rest of the show's offerings. A mob of seemingly mutated, almost animalistic townspeople trudged by firelight, as what I assumed was the player character picked them off in ruthless silence, save for the sickening crunch of his weapon embedded into sinewy flesh. And the player character himself, complete with tricorn hat and leather mantle, looked absolutely striking, a gothic interpretation of an old English highwayman almost. The trailer ends, in retrospect, somewhat oddly, with the cleric beast, the game's first optional boss, attacking the character deep inside what appears to be a tomb of sorts. The cleric beast is never fought here, but it did provide a tantalising glimpse at the incredible art direction and enemy design the game would employ. I was definitely intrigued, but upon further research, realising this was at least somewhat related to Dark Souls, I was concerned that while the setting and haunting atmosphere captivated me, the game would be inaccessible. It would be far too hard. It was daunting. However, come August of that same year, our next big look at Bloodborne materialised in the form of the Gamescom gameplay announcement trailer, finally providing those of us new to Souls games with a deeper, clearer look at what we'd actually be doing in this grim new world. And I remember it vividly. This was the trailer that got me completely hooked. I hadn't even played the game yet, and maybe it would still prove too difficult, but this, to me, is the quintessential Bloodborne trailer. Gone is the pure focus on horror. Instead, the game is presented as a sublime mix of theatrical gothic flamboyance, incredible action, monstrous abominations, and an intriguing mystery woven into the centre of it all. As the ominous, gravelly voiced narrator breathes the words, "The Hunter's Return," as if lost on the wind, we see that very hunter walk the streets of Yharnam itself. As the sinister backing music begins to build, cackling hags dance madly in the fields. And finally, ending on a more game-accurate appearance of the cleric beast this time, the music abruptly comes to an end, with the visuals lingering on a hunter's dream aflame as a man in a wheelchair and his companion look on silently. In my mind, this trailer masterfully captures everything that makes Bloodborne so special. And although I didn't know that just yet, it was enough to make me desperate to try it for myself. I mean, just look at the way the hunter faces down those two massive, snarling wolves, only to pull out a colossal curved scythe in response, jamming the blade onto the shaft itself with a visceral bluntness. One of the first real teases of the trick weaponry mechanic that would prove central to the Bloodborne experience. The music adds wonderfully to the melancholy, somber atmosphere, beginning with a creeping, chilling vocal performance that swells to bombast as the madness takes hold in the trailer. Again, little did I know that this was my first taste of what would become one of, if not my absolute favourite video game soundtrack of all time. A mere month later, EGX 2014 provided me with my first opportunity to go hands-on with the game. If you don't know, EGX is an annual gaming expo held in London, where many of the biggest upcoming titles can be tried out early by the general public. Although EGX's prominence has greatly diminished these days, it feels like back then it was a fantastic experience, and 2014 must have been one of the earliest shows I attended. And after playing Bloodborne for the first time, well, I didn't really get it. At all. I was totally stumped, in fact. Again, I'd never played a Souls game in my life, and it showed. At one point I picked up a pebble, and after pointlessly throwing my Molotov cocktails against a wall as I tried to learn the buttons, succeeded in aggroing the entire central Yharnam citizen mob with this one rock, resulting in a very quick and very brutal death. Despite that disappointing showing where I didn't even manage to make it to the cleric beast, I didn't even have a clue where I was really supposed to be going, I realised that it was my own lack of skill and experience that hampered it and didn't hold it against the game, coming away still enthralled and excited to play the game when it finally arrived the following year. And then if we skip ahead, March 27th, 2015, the game released here in the UK. Keen to play, but still unsure as to how far into the experience I would even manage to get, I made sure not to put any actual money towards the purchase, instead trading in a bunch of titles at my local game to meet the price point. It was a wary yet optimistic purchase, to say the least. The great irony here being nowadays I'll never pass up a Souls Special Edition. In fact, Millennia sits on my desk to this day. All of this to say, that's why I think my history with Bloodborne is probably a fairly common one. With the rapid ascent of the PS4 at the start of the 8th generation, all eyes were on it and its hotly anticipated titles, meaning for many gamers, Bloodborne was likely their first exposure to From Software and likely their first trip into Miyazaki's world. Interestingly, in retrospect, I can't help but think that Bloodborne was the perfect game to act as an introduction to Souls for me. Making this my first foray into that subgenre meant that I was diving headfirst into the deep end, so to speak, without even really knowing it. I think most would agree that certainly at the time of its release, and maybe even still today, Bloodborne was the hardest of From Software's Souls-style titles. Abandoning the sluggish pace of its predecessors, Bloodborne threw players into the maw of death itself, daring hunters to dance a perilous dance with their now extremely aggressive foes. In fact, aggression is the name of the game when it comes to Bloodborne, where patience is often a virtue in Demon's Souls and the two Dark Souls titles that followed, and perhaps the most reliable strategy in those games is to bulk up behind a shield while slowly but surely whittling away at equally defensive and tanky enemies. Bloodborne openly and with disdain does away with all of that, even mocking the passivity that's engendered by using shields in a very nice piece of meta, self-aware commentary. Because this was my first title in the Souls genre, this new, hyper-aggressive style of gameplay was all that I knew. It was what I adapted to, what I grew accustomed to. The immensely quick step dodge that can be initiated while strafing with a simple tap of the circle button feels like a blur in comparison to the movement options available in prior entries. So, while Bloodborne offers a very different style of gameplay to its forebears, I think it was on the whole a very beneficial one to learn first. The enemies in particular in Bloodborne are terrifyingly quick, often lunging and leaping at you with no care or worry for self-preservation whatsoever. Of course, some of the trademark hulking Souls monstrosity bosses are still here, and many of the same tried and true tactics apply, but your average enemy is way more likely to get up close and personal with you much faster and much earlier on. Speaking of bosses, you only have to look at the third boss of Bloodborne to see see this new, different philosophy in action. Where many will point to Father Gascoigne as being the first real test of your skills, you're adapting to Bloodborne's new mechanics and style, and they'd be right to do so. For me, no early game boss better encompasses Bloodborne's message to the player than the blood-starved beast. Whether it was by sheer luck or what, I actually found Gascoigne to be fairly easy to take down on my first playthrough. No, it was the blood-starved beast that acted as my personal trial by fire. This wiry, demonic boss stalks you through its arena, often swinging wildly and erratically in your direction, with the possibility of hitting you many, many times at once if caught in the wake of its claw swipes. This is a fight where, certainly if you're totally new to the franchise like I was, you'll be kept on your toes from start to finish. And although its weaknesses become clearer to the veteran player, the blood-starved beast feels like an impenetrable, terrifying display of mad brutality, with seemingly very few openings and little chance to react, especially as the fight wears on and it begins spewing poison everywhere. It doesn't help that the music for this boss fight is a cacophony of stress-inducing strings designed to ramp up the tension and the sweat as time goes on. It's amazing, and it killed me maybe 30 times in total, but once I finally beat it, that was the moment the game's systems truly clicked for me. Bloodborne's speed, its pacing, its ferocity would go on to lay the groundwork for virtually all of From's future titles. Dark Souls 3 would shift away from the slower nature of its predecessors and adopt a style far closer to that of Bloodborne itself, while Sekiro's Shadows Die Twice would condense that high-speed fury down even further, perfecting the art of incredibly fast combat. And finally, most recently, Elden Ring would take it to the next level, with bosses that were more ferocious, more agile, and more capable than anything really glimpsed in Bloodborne at that time 7 years earlier. But because Bloodborne was my first, I've always felt very well prepared for the challenges that came after. Adjusting to the older titles proved slightly harder, and I've never really been a fan of that slowed down, shield up playstyle. In fact, with Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2, I've tried to emulate the feel of Bloodborne as closely as possible. But doing so is a more dangerous game, as what you wear in those titles has more of a bearing and more of an impact than it does here in Bloodborne, and I'd often be wearing the bare minimum to move as quickly, to roll as more effectively as possible. That being said, I still think sinking hundreds of hours into Bloodborne first put me in good stead. Finally going back to the original Dark Souls so many years later, and honestly, it felt easy in comparison to what comes after. Bloodborne also works well as a first Souls title due to its streamlined and in some ways restrained nature. As I alluded to earlier, there's a lot less to worry about in Bloodborne overall. No, we're not quite as stripped back as we will find ourselves in Sekiro, but there are far fewer weapons to choose from here, and clothing only really matters in the sense of whether or not you feel like a total badass or not. Whether or not Bloodborne was the birthplace of fashion souls or not, I'm not sure, but it was certainly its peak. No game oozes style quite like it. The idea of trick weapons, one of Bloodborne's best and most versatile mechanics, basically doubles the number of weapons available to you, allowing you to transform each primary weapon you can hold into something more devastating but perhaps more cumbersome to use, or just changing its playstyle altogether. Trick weaponry is something that is exclusive to Bloodborne essentially, and I'd love to see it make a return at some point in the future because it really is one of the most creative implementations of weaponry the Souls series has really ever seen. There's nothing quite like swiping with Ludwig's Holy Blade only to then slam it into a massive broadsword, even a Zweihander, that's the size this weapon actually is, and bring it crashing down onto an enemy's head. Or maybe you're using the Kirkhammer, which is also a smaller, speedier, scrappier weapon, until you decide to lock it into place in the enormous concrete block that you're somehow carrying on your back and turn it into a massive warhammer. This sort of thing is so awesome, and for me at least made up for the fact that there weren't that many weapons in the game. Again, having not played any of the previous titles, that didn't disappoint me at all, though I know some found that aspect of the game to be a little bit of a letdown. Personally, even after playing the prior and future titles, I'd probably rather have the innate creativity of the trick weaponry system than hundreds of weapons that I'll just never use. But with all this talk of mechanics and playstyles, we're getting ahead of ourselves. What actually is Bloodborne? What's it about? What are we even doing in this damnable city in the first place?
Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Until now, I'd structured this video under the impression that you probably know what Bloodborne is, but for the uninitiated that still somehow remain, Bloodborne is an action RPG developed by genre masters From Software under the watchful eye of director Hidetaka Miyazaki. Like its accompanying titles, Bloodborne is a tale shrouded in mystery. There's a plot of sorts, but the game is purposefully cryptic and obfuscates much of what you need to know to make it through the night. As a hunter of beasts, you arrive in a crumbling, desiccated corpse of a city known as Yharnam, seeking a cure for a mysterious illness that plagues you. Yharnam is well known across the land for its legendary blood-healing techniques, its blood ministration, the source of which is cloaked in secrecy. But something has clearly gone very wrong by the time you arrive. The city is now at the mercy of a hideous sickness, with the townspeople transformed into beast-like terrors. On the night of the hunt, where the now maddened Yharnamites supposedly venture out in search of beasts to kill, you, the eponymous hunter, must rid the city of their stench, seek out the source of the plague, and escape the never-ending nightmare. To accomplish your goal, you find allies in a seemingly closed-off realm known as the Hunter's Dream. The doll, a quiet, subservient marionette given life, and Gehrman, a wheelchair-bound hunter of old who teaches you the ways of bloodletting.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
Meanwhile, the Hunter's Dream itself is an eerie yet picturesque isolated slab of land atop which a workshop sits surrounded by graves and flowers. The dichotomy there between beauty and death is a great one, and it's a line that's often blurred many times over throughout this game. The story of Bloodborne itself is vague, with tidbits of lore being drip-fed to you through item descriptions, inane, often deranged NPC ramblings, and whatever you can scour from your time in the city and beyond. Let's talk about Yharnam, because despite all else it might just be my favourite thing about Bloodborne. Yharnam, the dread city that almost the entire game revolves around, is one of the best, most meticulously crafted and well put together game worlds I have ever had the privilege to explore. The city's many dark, intertwining streets are often tightly packed together, creating a crushing sensation of claustrophobia, the inky black cobblestones laced with a creeping blanket of fog that slithers along the ground, its smoky trails outstretched like the legs of a spider. There's a great mystique to Yharnam. The overwhelming feeling of unease that permeates every step you take is built upon a foundation that something is desperately wrong here, even beyond the fact that the dwellers have all lost their minds, and many their human forms. There's an evil at work behind the veil, and you can't help but feel a sense of sadness as you progress further. The villagers, now monsters themselves, fear you, desperately trying to keep you at bay, believing you to be the plague-ridden rat, when in reality you're here to purge the cobbles of their ilk. The moon hangs low over the cityscape at all times, like a watchful eye, bathing the many towers and spires in its grim glow. The journey through Bloodborne's world, and so by extension the descent into the depths of Yharnam itself, is a spiralling fall into madness. There's evidence to show that Yharnam was once a great city, but it's now literally a shadow of its former self, its best and brightest institutions either fallen into darkness or corrupted, twisted and vile. Some may criticise Bloodborne for feeling too samey over the course of its 60 or so hour story, but I couldn't disagree with that more. Don't get me wrong, I love the lands of Lordran and Lothric, for example, but very little about them actually feels cohesive when laid out sprawling before you. When you move from one zone to the next, finding yourself at once in a lava-filled cavern or a poisonous bog or a network of catacombs or a gigantic castle, it might be cleverly interconnected, but it feels at its core like a video game, dropping you from distinguishable biome to biome. Of all the locations the Souls series has ever taken us to, outside of perhaps Ashina Castle, Yharnam feels the most like it could have been a real place at one time. It's impeccably well designed and fleshed out, from the central hub of the Cathedral Ward, which puts players at the foot of Yharnam's greatest religious monument, the Grand Cathedral, the centrepiece of the entire city, to the ruins of Old Yharnam, the original section of the city that was first abandoned and torched to the ground in a vain attempt to stop the spread of the disease. It's the prevailing consistency of Yharnam's world design that actually makes it so appealing to me. Yharnam then is perhaps the area that benefits the most from the Souls series' design philosophy of letting players see the places they can reach eventually at almost any time. Being able to see the belching black smoke of the haunting orphanage of the Upper Cathedral Ward very early on gives players a brief insight into some of the truly despicable evil that's taking place in this city long thought dead. Or similarly, being able to glimpse the tattered remains of the Forbidden Woods' windmills through the haze around Cathedral Ward from one of its many spiralling stone staircases and iron-wrought railings. But the glory of Yharnam doesn't just lie in its buildings and landscapes. Bloodborne's central plot might be obtuse, but it's in the smaller, more personal stories that this world truly shines, for better or for worse. On a micro level, Yharnam succeeds massively, introducing players to some of the most famous NPCs in a Souls game to date, each trying either to survive this hellish night or reap the benefits of it.
So, what say you? Our prey might differ, but we are hunters, the both of us. Why not cooperate and discuss the things we've learned?
From the unseen Gilbert who speaks to you from behind his window pane as he succumbs to his illness, to the seemingly angelic Yosefka whose clinic you wake up in at the start of the game. The story of Gascoigne's little girl is legendary as she attempts to cross the city herself during the night of the hunt and find her father, only to meet a grisly end in the dank sewers below. As you move deeper into the world, you'll encounter fellow hunters and rare allies, like Eileen the Crow, whose outfit is reminiscent of a Black Death-era plague doctor, and whose mind walks the delicate tightrope that all bloodlusted hunters must traverse. Will Eileen succeed in purging some of her fellow fallen hunters, or will she too succumb to the blood? While you can directly get involved in the outcome of that particular plot, most of these stories unfold without ever actually seeing the action on screen. It's really very clever and drives that sense of mystery. None of these tales are yours to know without taking the time to explore every inch of the city, and most likely across multiple playthroughs.
What are you still doing here? Enough trembling in your boots. A hunter must hunt.
No game world has succeeded with its atmosphere quite like Bloodborne. Yharnam and its inhabitants are positively dripping in it from start to finish. Whether friend or foe, you can't speak to a character in this game without them trailing off into an ominous chuckling that leaves you questioning their motives, and the haunting, stifling, oppressively funereal nature of the world is exquisite to behold. The entire city is draped in a dreamlike haze, and this feels especially apparent when you stop to take in the surroundings and the skyline in particular, the gleam of the setting sun helping to plunge the city's gothic architecture into further darkness. The art direction of Bloodborne is so unbridled, so thoroughly confident that it exudes clarity, the clarity of vision. From Software's art team deserves all the credit in the world, for they carry such unfettered heft, such weighty, lofty talent. Almost every angle of Yharnam could be a painting, it's so worthy of watercolours. Perhaps this is why the game has inspired such a fervent art community around it even to this day. Its artistic merit stands head and shoulders above so much else on the scene. Now, despite what you may think so far, the purpose of this video isn't to be a full in-depth look at every facet of the story, every weapon, every encounter, every item, and every aspect of the game. Instead, I want to take you on a journey through Bloodborne itself, visiting the different locations, meeting some of the characters, and experiencing the haunting stories they have to tell, all the while breaking down how everything comes together so fluidly and so naturally as to create one of, if not the best games ever made. Bloodborne is From Software's gothic masterpiece, their crowning achievement in atmospheric environmental storytelling, combined with sublime and above all challengingly fun gameplay. And where better to start than at the beginning? Bloodborne is blessed with having one of the greatest opening areas to a game ever. In fact, it's so good that there's an argument to be made the game actually peaks here, in some ways at least. Of course, I'm talking about Central Yharnam. The game begins, and after a definitely above-board blood transfusion and narrowly escaping a beast in the depths of Yosefka's clinic, your hunter heaves open the groaning ornate gates and steps out into Central Yharnam itself. In the context of the rest of the game, this is a perplexing area. The name Central Yharnam would imply this is the hub of the entire city, so putting it first and foremost is an interesting move, especially since I would consider Cathedral Ward to be a more accurate nexus for Yharnam itself. If anything, Central Yharnam seems to be predominantly a residential part of the city, which is why it makes sense that the clinic would be located here. When I think of Yharnam, I think of Central Yharnam most of all. The winding streets and narrow alleys filled with wandering residents, the eerie sound of an axe scraping along the floor ringing loud in the night air. Cobblestone paths, decorative fountains, towering stunning buildings, and overturned carriages paint a portrait of an affluent, even opulent civilization now reduced to death and decay. The residents themselves seemingly unable to even heed what's become of their home. Central Yharnam does an excellent job at introducing you to the world of Bloodborne and its systems. As you round the first corner, the initial enemy is obscured behind a carriage, but there's plenty of wiggle room, space, and time to reassess and make a move once combat is engaged. In fact, the first enemy you meet here will be one of the axe-wielding villagers holding a flame torch, and their swing will almost certainly miss, striking the floor instead, giving you an opportunity to take them down. As mentioned before, Bloodborne is all about being aggressive and staying on the front foot as much as possible. A unique mechanic to this game, the regain system, helps facilitate this gameplay, encouraging you to hack and slash away at enemies as much as possible. When you take damage, your health bar will deplete as expected, but rather than emptying completely, in its place remains a paler version of that health you just lost. For a few vital seconds after being hit, you're able to strike back at your opponent and regain some of your lost health. And the game actually affords you precious room to breathe in this first tiny closed-off section of Central Yharnam. But the regain system is a core mechanic that totally defines Bloodborne and tells you everything you need to know about what the developers expect from you. They want you to be savage in your approach. Smart, but savage all the same. After you defeat the first few enemies, Central Yharnam directs you towards your first shortcut, a locked gate that has sealed off the main high street. Instead, you'll have to take the ladder up to the next level, already showcasing this area's multi-tiered approach to design, packed with detail. A shrill scream as you climb the ladder sends a tremor down your spine. There's evidently more than just men with axes to be found here. But look, before you climb, glance out across the chasm at what lies slightly below Central Yharnam to catch sight of one of the prominent towers of Old Yharnam lost to the mists down beneath. As you make your way through the dilapidated streets, you'll encounter various humanoid enemies, mangy dogs, and caped ogres wielding chunks of stone, as well as enormous, prowling, hunchbacked wolves. Easily some of the creepiest looking enemies in the game, with their eyes like embers among coals glinting at you from the shadows. All of this culminates in the first climactic boss battle against the cleric beast, a shrieking behemoth and itself a staunch reminder of how man overstepped its bounds and fell as a result. But there's even more to Central Yharnam than this. Several back alleys which loop round to the start of the area create one of the most satisfying shortcuts in the game, likely to be the first one of real consequence for the player, while an entire sewer network lies beneath the city itself. The sewers, although contained within Central Yharnam, could have honestly been an entire area unto themselves, and discovering the man-eating pig lying in wait is still one of the freakiest moments in the game. It's true, when looking at it from on high, that Central Yharnam is probably one of the most complex and intricately woven areas in the game. Very few areas that follow can really live up to it in that regard, and it makes the absolute most of the wonderful gothic setting surrounding it. But it is also Bloodborne at its most vanilla, and the game only proceeds to get stranger and wilder from here on out. The entire Central Yharnam area is capped off with the first mandatory boss of the game, Father Gascoigne, once a fellow hunter like yourself driven mad by the Beast Plague.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
Gascoigne is a great example of the nuance and subtlety this game is able to weave into its storytelling. For many players, Gascoigne will just be another boss, a vicious, violent display of power and skill, the first of many hunter versus hunter duels to come, and a great testing ground for your ability to successfully parry with the firearm. But for those willing to dig a bit deeper, Gascoigne is one of the most tragic characters in this world, and it's possible to play witness to the demise of his entire family. As an aside, it's fascinating how much it seems like the developers were inspired by Resident Evil 4 when designing Central Yharnam. This is something I've only just noticed, as the recent Resident Evil 4 remake is the first time I've ever played the game. Stay tuned for that video, by the way, but it's all here in Central Yharnam. You round a corner to see a horde of infected villagers surrounding someone, or in this case something, being burned at a stake. Later, the chilling toll of a far-off bell seems to rouse them, and they all trudge in a trance-like state to where they need to be. Moving on to my personal favourite area in the game, Cathedral Ward is where Bloodborne really opens up. Featuring much of the same incredibly designed architecture as Central Yharnam, Cathedral Ward now soaks everything in a sinister pale light, an eerie lavender that coats the entire area and emanates from the eye-laden lanterns of the spectral wanderers that walk its streets. Here, where Central Yharnam was made up of cramped residential streets, Cathedral Ward has space to spread out, featuring enormous circular plazas adorned with statues. As the hunter arrives in the Holy Church district, the imagery here is striking. The grand cathedral and all that surrounds it still stands tall, a reminder of Yharnam's past graces, but the rot has set in. You get the sense that these creatures that were perhaps once men would be seen as blasphemous and unholy, particularly those garbed in black closer to the doors of the cathedral itself. The game now replaces the trademark Yharnam black brick with a material that looks more reminiscent of bleached white bone, similar to the cloaks and gowns worn by the church servants. Coils of smoke waft from incense burners left out to ward off evil spirits as massive hunched axe-wielding chapel giants lumber down majestic curved staircases, their dirtied, holy attire shredded and torn. Looming above it all is the astral clock tower, the clock face constantly emitting a sickly, baleful glow, peering down upon the Cathedral Ward and its forsaken inhabitants at all times. Cathedral Ward acts as the player's main hub in the game and their base of operations. From the Erden Chapel acting as an unlikely refuge not just for you, but for any lost souls you might encounter on your travels, you can make your way further into Cathedral Ward or push on into the desolation of Old Yharnam. It's also possible to access the Healing Church workshop here, which leads you into Upper Cathedral Ward much later. From the edge of the Grand Cathedral, you're able to visit Hemwick Charnel Lane, and from the main plaza of the ward itself is the path you need to forge ahead, heading deep out of Yharnam's walls and into the Forbidden Woods. The boss of Cathedral Ward is Vicar Amelia, and in my opinion, this is the boss that best represents the game as a whole. Transgression is a major theme of Bloodborne, and that's Vicar Amelia's whole deal. When we first see her, she's kneeling at an altar of prayer, but the words escaping her lips speak of a monstrous belief that men are frail and clearly some form of ascension is needed to elevate them beyond their perceived weaknesses. Amelia is granted that transformation when she mutates into a nightmarish Wendigo, foregoing her humanity completely and becoming a shrieking atrocity in the process. Battling this holy figure turned snarling beast under the decorated roof of a great church, while an incredible orchestra blares, perfectly encapsulates Bloodborne to me. Taking on these fallen figures of Yharnam authority who give in to their beastly desires and ambitions captures not only the horror, but the pomp and theatricality of the game perfectly. When Vicar Amelia, still retaining a shred of her former self, attempts to pray in order to restore some of her health, is a fantastic visual and makes for one of my favourite boss battles of the game, and one that truly screams Bloodborne. Old Yharnam, found by entering a secret underground passageway through a crypt beneath a chapel in Cathedral Ward, has a distinct look and feel that completely separates it from the rest of the game's locations. As the name suggests, this is an original subsection of the wider city that has been completely lost to the plague. Snippets of lore reveal that the people burned Old Yharnam to the ground in an attempt to stall the spread of the disease to the upper levels. While they clearly weren't successful, there's something truly haunting about traversing Old Yharnam's streets. There's an echo of history here, and Old Yharnam provides us with our clearest look yet at the final outcome of the desperate situation the entire city of Yharnam currently finds itself grappling with. What's truly fascinating, I think, about Old Yharnam is that there is no humanity left here whatsoever. We might foolishly think there's some hope yet for the denizens of the city found in the higher levels, but for those in Old Yharnam, time has clearly run out. This area has long fallen to ruin and doom. A lone hunter, driven mad, battles to keep the infection contained from atop his solitary perch, an unlikely last bastion of defense for the upper levels. His voice rings out across the streets, warning you to stay away, or else he'll open fire with his Gatling gun without mercy.
Didn't you see the warning? Turn back at once. Old Yharnam, burned and abandoned by men, is now home only to beasts. They are of no harm to those around. Turn back, or the hunter will face the hunt.
Immediately, this place feels so different from anything before. There's no sign of anything remotely human left in this place, which is now little more than a shadow. What does it most for me, I think, is the absence of light. Even in the upper part of Old Yharnam, fires help to bring some semblance of warmth and a glow to this area, but the further down you descend, to the place where clearly the fires began, there's nothing really here but pure and total blackness. Gaunt, skeletal, hooded beastmen stalk the streets, appearing through the mist, their howls and cries piercing the cold night air. Here the beasts are deadlier than ever, their eyes gleaming a hungry scarlet. Despite being an entire area unto itself, Old Yharnam is completely optional, but you'd be a fool to miss it. It provides one of the toughest early game challenges Bloodborne has to offer, with enemies that are more aggressive and more plentiful than before, often attacking in packs on top of an intensely dark atmosphere. But it's also here that it becomes readily apparent that these men that have fully succumbed to beasthood now fear fire above all else, presumably because fire cleanses all. But all hope is gone from this place. Now all that's left for you to do is to purge as many beasts as possible. This is where, at the end of a lengthy descent, you'll find the blood-starved beast, a boss that fits this area exceptionally well. Gruesome, completely bestial, and terrifying, the blood-starved beast has taken up residence in the shattered remains of a chapel at the very base of the town. Yet another great metaphor for the imagery Bloodborne is trying to convey. Another optional area comes in the form of Hemwick Charnel Lane, accessed via a small wooded path from the Grand Cathedral. Despite this being a fairly simple and linear area, I absolutely adore it. Visually, Hemwick Charnel Lane might be one of my favourites of the entire game. There's so much detail packed into this macabre stretch of Yharnam's outskirts, from rugged cliffsides to abandoned derelict shacks and stables. Thousands upon thousands of gravestones line the craggy rock faces, while creepy towers jut out of the earth, their spires pointed and sharp like a witch's hat. All the while Yharnam looms in the distance, giving players their first good look at the city from the outside, and it's pretty spectacular. Even Hemwick, which itself is pretty closed off and narrow, opens up a little as we approach the boss's castle and reach the edge of the land, with a sheer cliff tapering off into the ocean itself. Grotesque, mangled corpses hang from withered trees, while a flock of crows hover overhead. Watchmen with their rifles and their dogs patrol the area, while the mad hags delight in their depravity. Even if Yharnam was once a genuinely good place, it's hard to imagine anything decent ever happening here. Even the name is synonymous with death itself. Now, I'm not going to pretend the Forbidden Woods is one of my favourite areas in the game. It's overly long, and the sameness of the environments is more apparent here than before, where the wooded setting just isn't as captivating as the city streets. That being said, From did an excellent job crafting a tense, creepy atmosphere here, where free from the cobblestones of Yharnam itself, the madness of the wilderness has taken hold. The Forbidden Woods encroaches on all who enter, and everything found within is tinged with disrepair. The windmill that acts as the main landmark before entering the woods proper is shredded and splintered, while the lone village deep in the trees is ramshackle and falling apart. Deadly traps litter the already treacherous path through the trees, designed to catch the careless wanderer off guard, and the journey is made all the worse by the litany of twisted creatures that lie in wait. From the monstrous snake nests to the shadowy, lumbering, infected villagers, which too feel like an homage to Resident Evil 4's Ganado, there's something vile around almost every turn here. The Forbidden Woods is a long and winding journey in and of itself, with the area being so large that it's effectively split into two separate halves. The progression of darkness is handled really well here, as the Forbidden Woods begins with enemies you're more used to seeing, before descending into the truly nightmarish in the second half. Speaking of descending into the truly nightmarish, at the end of the long, daunting road that is the Forbidden Woods, moonlight spills through the trees and you step out into a clearing. Before you sits a squat but proud-looking building, perhaps better preserved than everything else your hunter has come across so far. A glittering lake lies still behind it like a slumbering beast waiting to stir. The moon hangs low above it, bulbous and beautiful and all-encompassing. Before you lies Byrgenwerth, a scholarly institution and one that now sits alone, but seemingly untouched by the ravages of the plague, gazing out forevermore at the reflection of the moon upon the water. There's something oddly serene about this image, something that feels at odds with the rest of the game, but there's a loneliness to it as well. And as with so much else in this world, there's something not quite right. For starters, on the narrow path to the university, the hunter encountered an enemy truly unlike anything they've seen before. A twisted amalgamation of man and fly, like a science experiment gone awry, and then at the rear of Byrgenwerth itself, by the lake's edge, you'll find perhaps the biggest clue to Bloodborne's ultimate truth. A strange, unidentifiable creature, one of a kind in the main game. It seems to call upon the very stars themselves to attack you, but it doesn't really put up much of a fight, and so despite its unfathomable appearance, it's quickly forgotten. Another clue lies in wait. A meek, hooded figure sits bent over a corpse. Maybe you've seen one of these beings before, but maybe you missed it back in the Cathedral Ward. This thing, in its monk-like tunic with its spindly hands and beard of wriggling tentacles, looks about as close to Cthulhu of Lovecraft's famous mythos as possible. But what does it mean? Either way, these strange, if at first unassuming creatures should be taken care of with efficiency if possible, or else you risk them latching onto your head and draining you of precious insight. Wait, insight? What does that mean? What on earth is insight? Blood Echoes I can understand, it's the standard currency found in all Souls games, but there's another currency as well? It's time to piece things together. In case you'd somehow missed it, Byrgenwerth serves as an early jumping off point, no pun intended. After leaping from the edge of the building into the lake, only to slip right through and land in a pearlescent mirror-like dimension, do things get really peculiar. It's here you face off against Rom the Vacuous Spider. Now, Rom was another trial by fire for me on my initial playthrough. I struggled endlessly with this strange, engorged arachnid, its weird stony face and dive-bombing minions putting me in the ground over and over. And considering it's my personal philosophy to approach every first playthrough of a new Souls game completely alone, to really bask in that idea of this being a solemn, lonesome journey, well, I struggled for a very long time. But despite that, there's an uncanny oddness to this fight that precludes what's about to come. The soundtrack, understated but excellent, whispers babbling, incomprehensible voices in your ears. And when Rom finally does die, it gives way to a new terror, a new truth, and the blood moon descends over Yharnam herself. The progression of the night sky in Bloodborne is fascinating. Upon starting the game, the night of the hunt is just getting underway. The sky is a shade of burnished orange, as though to appear aflame. But upon killing Vicar Amelia, time marches forwards, plunging your surroundings into the unwelcome hold of night. And then, after Rom's death, things change once more to reflect the madness that's been unshackled. Of course, Yharnam and Bloodborne itself hides its biggest and best secret until about the halfway point of the game. In the run-up to release, marketing materials wisely made the game appear more conventional than it actually was. It looked like you were visiting a city where the inhabitants had become werewolf-like beasts, and it was your job to clear them out. But the sickness at the heart of Yharnam runs far deeper and stranger than that. What's amazing about Bloodborne and the presentation of its world is the way it evolves throughout the course of the game thanks to that little currency called insight. Insight might just be one of the smartest, most inspired ideas for a game currency I have ever seen. And it is just that, insight. How much you've seen, how much you really know about what's going on behind the curtain in this weird, warped world. The further you travel into the depraved carcass of Yharnam, the more horrifying and increasingly unfathomable the creatures and enemies become. And so your insight continues to rise with each and every encounter. It's like the prickle on the back of your neck that causes hairs to stand on end, a cold, rippling shiver.
Do you hear the graveyard murmurs? Then it's almost time. Oh, I can't wait. I just can't wait.
You know with increasing certainty that something is very wrong here, but to what end you're not sure. In my opinion, this build-up crescendos through the first half of the game, reaching the Forbidden Woods and eventually the hidden University of Byrgenwerth, where you first encounter your first Fly Scholar. It's at this point where I think it really clicks, that we're no longer in the realm of simple werewolves and vampires and whatever else you think might be going on here. There's an argument to be made that the fact was clear in the woods themselves, but the real twist comes when you step outside your sanctuary in Cathedral Ward, only to be met with a massive, eldritch creature perched atop the building, dangling overhead, flailing tentacles and colossal spider-like hands clutching onto the stone. It observes you in total silence, with a seeming casual interest as it watches you from above. How long has this creature been here? Has it just appeared? We've traversed this area many times before, and yet this being has only just become visible. Hasn't it? While it's possible to have met this creature, this amygdala, briefly before, it was only in passing. Now, with the death of Rom and the awakening of your higher perception, you can see all that is truly going on, what form the world really takes now the lines have been successfully blurred. This is where the true genius of Bloodborne lies. Even if the game's premise was a more conventional take on the Monster of the Week werewolf hunter story, it would still be great. But what really elevates it is this sick, dark truth at the beating heart of it all. This is no mere monster story. This is a full-on Lovecraftian hellscape. In the bowels of Yharnam, beneath the stone and civilization, humans dug too deep, and they communed too eagerly, too keen and willing to take what was offered to them by beings they rightly had no comprehension of. The Great Ones. Not of this earth, but of the stars above, the Great Ones, terrible, unknowable, eldritch beings, were quickly revered and worshipped by both the Thumerians who initially discovered them and the Yharnamites that would follow. And now in the modern day, that which lay beneath Yharnam has once again been found. In their pursuit of knowledge, in their desire to gain the insight necessary to perceive the Great Ones at all, for they exist on a higher, separate plane than humanity, and in their quest to use the Great Ones' miracle blood to heal their sick, the two great institutions of Yharnam, the Healing Church and the Byrgenwerth scholars, pushed the boundaries of taboo in an effort to lift their city to lofty new heights. They plundered the cosmos, conducting unholy communion rituals, and in their complacency and ecstasy doomed themselves to the everlasting nightmare. Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church's leaders, Willem and Lawrence respectively, would coin the adage, "Fear the old blood," by which to live safely by, but only one of them would heed it in the end.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood.
The second half of Bloodborne uses Lovecraftian horror extremely effectively, taking a mythos that's often difficult to depict due to the existential nature of the beings involved, and delivering one of the very best Lovecraftian tales you could ask for. The team at From Software understood what Lovecraft himself was trying to convey. The sense of the sublime, one of the most prominent tropes of gothic fiction, that sense of smallness, of insignificance in the face of unimaginable terrors. It explores the many transgressions of the Yharnamites, and how Yharnam itself became a harvesting ground for madmen, and how warring schools of thought brought complete and utter ruin to the city and its people. Once this disturbing truth is revealed and the curtain is lifted on the reality of Yharnam itself, the game goes out of its way to deliver on that by dropping you in one of Bloodborne's most foul, warped locations. Yahar'gul, the unseen village, is a vessel for Yharnam's sins. Drenched in the hot, fleshy colours of the blood moon as it eclipses the skyline, this is the city as you've never seen it before. Colossal, spider-like amygdalas watching their subjects with that casual, detached intrigue as though they were marionettes playing with their puppets. Tortured amalgamations of flesh and bone drag themselves along the streets with guttural wails and moans. Sinister, bell-ringing witches command the reanimated bodies of citizens, and at the end of it all, a manufactured Great One, the One Reborn, perhaps the endgame of the scholar's twisted rituals, arrives from the cosmic void itself. But Yahar'gul is interesting in that it can be accessed far earlier in the game than this. Once you've slain the blood-starved beast, but before the blood moon has descended, it's possible to be transported here from Cathedral Ward, yet another, albeit more unexpected, connection to that main hub. For many players, their first encounter with the nefarious kidnapper enemies is likely to end in death or retreat. They're immensely powerful, and if they defeat you, you'll be bundled into their bloodied bag and imprisoned in the Hypogean jail within Yahar'gul itself. Although the Blood Moon hasn't yet taken hold, and therefore you won't typically have the insight required to bear witness to the amygdala, something is clearly darkly wrong with this place from the moment you awaken behind bars. For starters, the soundtrack here is utterly chilling. Hail the Nightmare is unique, providing us with a powerful vocal track that purrs darkly when wandering the world itself, outside of a boss encounter. And it seems to only grow in power the further you stray from that initial point of awakening in your cell. It might seem odd to linger on a single track like this when the entire soundtrack is so momentously good, but I feel I have to give Hail the Nightmare its dues. It's here that Bloodborne comes the closest to pure horror, to infecting the player with a real fear of the unknown, a true sense of dread. Although I do believe Bloodborne to be a highly theatrical experience, it's times like this that it does away with that flamboyance and artistry and doubles down on the terror. The almost Gregorian chant is downright satanic, and it's very easy to imagine the most devout of Bloodborne's scholars and scientists singing it, their hands clasped in prayer as they worshipped the old blood itself. It's brilliant stuff, and the sort of thing that elevates this game beyond the pale. Moving on, it feels odd to delineate somewhere as being specifically forsaken in the world of Bloodborne, but perhaps that simply highlights the level of depravity taking place within Cainhurst Castle. Cainhurst is an interesting chunk of the game. Unlike the vast majority of Yharnam and its surrounding areas, Cainhurst is in no way attached to the wider interconnected world, instead operating in its own separate realm entirely. Once you collect the summons invitation from Yosefka's clinic, you'll be able to wait for the grim stagecoach that arrives at the obelisk in Hemwick Charnel Lane. Upon arrival at Cainhurst Castle, the horses pulling the coach appear to be dead. Perhaps they were always that way, perhaps these corpses have been long sitting here in the ice. The pull of the supernatural is stronger here in Cainhurst Castle than anywhere else in the game, and the entire area feels oddly spectral in nature. Cainhurst Castle brings with it a fresh new look and feel to the game, although in keeping with the gothic standard that's been set so far. The castle itself is buried under snow, hundreds of icicles hanging from every outcrop like wicked daggers ready to drop. The journey to get here, the corpse horses pulling the carriage, and the snow-blasted appearance make Cainhurst feel like it's trapped in time somewhere, isolated and shut off from everything else. That's not to say there's nothing living here at all. Vile, blood-sucking monsters waddle about the castle grounds with swollen stomachs, while winged beasts perch on the parapets like gargoyles. Frail old men tend endlessly to the castle, patrolling its corridors with candelabras, but it's the ghostly denizens that represent the true story of Cainhurst Castle. And what a story it is too, at times totally separate from the events taking place in Yharnam, while also connected. Cainhurst Castle was at one time home to the vile blood nobility, who existed on the highest rung of society. Eventually, war was waged against the vile blood by the Healing Church, which dispatched its executioners to sack Cainhurst Castle and kill everyone inside. The vengeful spirits of howling widows that still haunt the cold stone castle are evidence enough that the executioners were successful in their purge, though in a great loss they were forced to abandon their master, Martyr Ligarius, as they destroyed the only path in and out of the castle. And Martyr Ligarius sits atop the castle to this day and acts as the boss of this area. Interestingly, the only real perspective you get on this conflict for the majority of the game is from Alfred, a seemingly friendly NPC who has made his way to Yharnam, yet is actually a member of the Executioners himself. Therefore, he's an unreliable narrator regarding the history between the Vile Bloods and the Church, and his questline later exposes him as perhaps having fallen to madness himself when he brutally murders the Queen of the Vile Bloods, Annalise, in her own throne chamber, should you lead him to her. Cainhurst Castle may feel like a completely separate chunk of the game when viewed alongside the rest of Bloodborne, but its lore is equally compelling, and to be totally honest, probably deserving of an entire video dedicated to itself. One of my personal favourite late game areas features a return to the Cathedral Ward, only this time we're heading on upwards, through the Healing Church workshop and up towards the sky. The tone of Upper Cathedral Ward is markedly different from that of Cathedral Ward, or really any area outside of possibly the Hypogean Jail and Yahar'gul. It's one of the spookiest areas in the game, with the emphasis placed firmly back onto horror once again. Originally home to the Choir, the Healing Church's highest order, Upper Cathedral Ward contains some of the game's deepest and darkest secrets. The most heinous of experiments and rituals were being carried out here at the point in Yharnam considered closest to the stars, like a wilting flower reaching desperately for the sunlight above. The orphanage, as mentioned earlier, is visible from early in the game. The plumes of putrid black smoke belching into the sky and the burning orange lights in the windows suggest some kind of latent activity, but the proprietors are, like everyone else, long gone. The orphanage and everything else in Upper Cathedral Ward has fallen to the beasts, but evidence remains of the truly awful nature of the Choir's crimes in the pursuit of ascension. Celestial children, slug-like kin, swarm the ground, and they likely stem from the orphanage itself. Upper Cathedral Ward attempts to blur the lines between dimensions. The sky and the cosmos are one. A seemingly innocuous letter in Cathedral Ward reads, but it's more accurate than you might dare think. It's here that you'll find evidence of the Church's attempts to play God. The Lumen Flower Gardens are home to a celestial mob of alien beings, while the source of the tainted blood used in Yharnam's blood ministration itself, Ebritas, Daughter of the Cosmos, can be found here. Interestingly, upon approach, Ebritas isn't aggressive and won't attack you until first threatened. Instead, the creature seems to be quietly mourning at an altar. As it ponders, I wonder if it has any idea the cataclysm it's indirectly inflicted upon Yharnam and its inhabitants. As an aside, Ebritas was another roadblock for me on my own journey. That makes 3 bosses that I found incredibly tough to defeat: the blood-starved beast, Rom, and now this eldritch abomination. Much like the Forbidden Woods before it, I'm not sure the Nightmare Frontier, or really any of the Nightmare segments of the game, are actually anyone's favourites. I'm sure there is someone somewhere. It's by design, sure, but the overall aesthetic is less cohesive, messier, and simply not as appealing, at least to me, as the rest of the game. To top things off, now at the tail end of the Bloodborne experience, this is where the difficulty is ratcheted up, not just through enemy encounters, but by piling on debuffs and status effects, whether that's poison, frenzy, or everything all at once. Despite that, there's still plenty of interest here. Of course, being a realm directly linked to the Nightmare itself, it's the most otherworldly location visited thus far. A mess of twisted clumps of earth and rock, glittering, fetid, poisonous swamps home to squid-like fiends, and an ethereal sky. Perhaps Bloodborne's single most deadly enemy, the Winter Lanterns, are also found here. Monstrous, otherworldly women whose brains have swelled to an immense size and are now littered with eyes. Simply being in their presence, simply seeing them is enough to make the hunter lose their mind. Like Insight, Frenzy is another really cool, well-implemented mechanic that's rooted in Lovecraftian mythos. The idea that merely knowing about or perceiving such cosmic terrors is enough to destroy a human's mind entirely. Unfortunately, unlike Insight, Frenzy is also incredibly annoying to deal with from a gameplay perspective. Unless you're able to escape the source or quickly try and counteract it by slamming countless sedatives, Frenzy is pretty much guaranteed death. The Nightmare Frontier is also home to the boss battle against the Amygdala, which ends up feeling oddly anticlimactic. Perhaps the build-up was always going to be a little too effective where this particular enemy was concerned. After all, these are the terrifying creatures that haunt the streets of Yharnam itself. They are what we have seen the most of. Patches makes his long-awaited appearance here as well, and again later in the lecture building. In true Bloodborne fashion, this time he takes the form of a grotesque spider, but with the same Patches face and smirk we all love to hate. The lecture building, while small, is also darkly effective. The scholars here have all been reduced to fleshy, slug-like creatures, still wearing their uniforms, in a pretty disconcerting show of their former humanity. It seems likely the lecture building was once a part of Byrgenwerth, but was severed and lost to the nightmare itself, permanently trapping the poor souls within as well.
Cause. Some say cosm.
As for the Nightmare of Mensis, the final area in the game, it's undoubtedly the toughest zone in Bloodborne. A baleful black castle that exists deep within the nightmare itself, hosted by a rambling madman.
Majestic! A hunter is a hunter, even in a dream.
The Nightmare of Mensis is home to all manner of mutated and seemingly experimental horrors, from gigantic spiders to snarling and squawking hybrids of dog and raven, to immense pigs with bulbous eyes littering their faces, to the returning winter lanterns, and so much more. Not only that, but from the highest windows of the castle, a deeply ominous crimson light flashes, drowning the surrounding mess of fleshy landscape in a maddening glow that's enough to cause insanity in even the most experienced of hunters. It's here in the Nightmare of Mensis that your long journey comes to a head. Having been haunted by the omnipresent cries of a newborn since killing Rom, you dispatch of the insane Mikolash, the current host of the nightmare, before reaching the uppermost level of the castle, Murgo's loft. Murgo, an infant Great One and child of Yharnam herself, is a peculiar part of the game's narrative. Despite being so central to the events unfolding, Murgo itself remains completely unseen, save for its black pram and the shrill, oddly human wail it emits. The game does a great job at conveying a general sense of unease across the cityscape during these sections. There's a weird feeling of stasis throughout, like Yharnam itself has reached the point of no return and now simply awaits the end. To reach Murgo, the hunter battles through its personal wet nurse, a haunting faceless seraphim, a fallen angel with the wings of an enormous black crow, before the child's cries cease for good. With the nightmare in turmoil and Yharnam seemingly crumbling from the inside out, everything seems to be coming to an end. There's just one thing left to do. The hunter's dream, which has been your refuge, your sanctuary away from the city, has erupted into flame. For you, good hunter, it is no longer needed. All that's left for you is to present yourself to Gehrman, who, standing tall from his wheelchair and taking up his scythe, prepares to kill you and free you from the nightmare itself. Your work is done. Within a stunning field of flowers, the moon sitting comfortably low in the background, Gehrman and the hunter are silhouetted, mere shadows on the scenic canvas laid out before you. It's a rare picture of true beauty. Not malformed, not bastardized, not shattered beauty as we've seen throughout Yharnam, but a genuine image full of emotion. And with that, with one sweeping motion, Gehrman sets you free. Your contract is fulfilled. As a hunter of beasts, you've done your part and found the source of the scourge, helping to bring an end to the night, to the hunt. Gehrman, resigned to remaining trapped within the hunter's dream forever, helps you to leave it. And every step you took, every path you walked, your very presence and being within the nightmare is immortalized in a single gravestone, like so many others before you, to be tended by the doll forevermore. As for the hunter, they awaken collapsed in Yharnam beneath the beating of a morning sun. Perhaps unable to believe they were lucky enough to see it for themselves, the hunter stumbles towards the light, as its warming golden glow at long last washes through the streets of Yharnam once again. The night always comes to an end, eventually. Unless it doesn't. Not for you. In a different ending altogether, the hunter rejects Gehrman's kindly offer of salvation. Saddened, Gehrman thinks you've been consumed by the hunt, blood-drunk, like so many poor fools lost to the nightmare. Except that's not the case, not really. The hunter has overcome it all, and in the end chose to set Gehrman free instead.
Tonight, Gehrman joins the hunt.
After an intense duel among the flowers, both sides trying to lift the other loose of their chains, the hunter finally bests their mentor, and Gehrman's everlasting torment comes to a close. But for you, this is only the beginning. Like a bud blooming from the blood moon, a great one called the Moon Presence descends, taking you in its embrace. The creator of the hunter's dream, the Moon Presence had bound Gehrman to his duties on this plane, and now, as your hunter is revealed to have taken up Gehrman's seat in his former chair, those duties instead fall to you, potentially for all eternity. Or not. Even the pull of the Moon Presence can be resisted. In a third and final ending, after consuming 3 umbilical cords, yes, that's right, the hunter will instead repel the Moon Presence, forcing it to turn hostile. Upon destroying it in a final battle among those flowers and once more slaying the nightmare, the hunter attains a new state of being. As the fires of the hunter's dream fizzle out, the doll collects what has become of the hunter from the ground. You've now transformed into a grotesque extraterrestrial slug and attained a higher form of existence, successfully ascending to godhood and becoming an infant great one in the process. With seemingly very little, if any, of your former self remaining, the doll takes you in her arms. 8 years ago, Bloodborne was a revelation, to me and to so many others. It carries with it today a weighty legacy it undoubtedly deserves. It's a masterpiece in Lovecraftian horror, truly understanding the source material, the mythos, and how to wield the tropes of the gothic genre to maximum effect. The deeper into the game you delve, the smaller you feel, as the reality of the horrendous situation in Yharnam begins to spill over. The Great Ones, ambivalent, uncaring but ever watchful and all-powerful, cling to the ruination they've helped wrought. There's so very much more to be said about Bloodborne, and in this video I barely scratched the surface. After all, there's the entire Chalice dungeon mechanic to touch on as well. There's immense depth to the game's mechanics, to its lore, to its world and characters, and believe me, we'll be returning to this game in the future. But to celebrate and honour its release, I wanted to take a walk through the hunter's journey, putting myself, us, in their shoes once again. And all of this without even peering into the game's lone expansion, The Old Hunters. Maybe the most essential piece of DLC ever created, which is absolutely a video for another time. Is Bloodborne a perfect game? No. It's in desperate need of some love and attention, perhaps most of all. Today, the game's stuttering and poor frame pacing is more apparent than ever, which makes it all the more frustrating that it's seemingly being left to languish in this state. With some simple updates to improve both the resolution and the frame rate, Bloodborne would continue to stack up to and likely surpass even the most modern of releases. The actual gameplay and the world that surrounds it is just that good. When I first picked up Bloodborne, I was apprehensive. I really had no idea if it'd ever click with me, let alone become a game I would consistently return to over and over again. For the hunter, the scourge is never truly over, the hunt never fully diminished. In fact, I think it might be time to return to Yharnam once again. And remember, no matter what you do, so long as you tread the cobbles of Yharnam yourself, above all else, fear the old blood.
And so the nightly hunt begins.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this retrospective of Bloodborne. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of Bloodborne, if you've ever played it, and if you have played it, how does it stack up for you, like it does for me as my favourite game of all time. Are you participating in Return to Yharnam? I'd love to know. Make sure to give the video a like if you did enjoy it, and also hit subscribe for more videos just like this one here on Mr. Tomo Talks Games. But until next time, guys, thank you again so much, and I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.